American University professor Andrew Demshuk, a specialist in Central European history, is author of The Lost German East, Forced Migration and the Politics of Memory, 1945 to 1970. Professor Demshuk teaches courses on modern German and East European history, as well as nationalism, genocide and ethnic cleansing, and the politics of memory in urban planning. His recent work centers on an analysis of ideology and public response in the post-World War II reconstruction of 3 urban centers that had once belonged to the German Reich and were rebuilt by West Germany, East Germany, and Poland. His latest book measures public response to the East German communist demolition of Leipzig's 15th century university church in the late 1960s as a means of measuring the relationship between regime and populace, something, if I understand, as he was explaining to me, he calls a layered space. Please welcome Professor Andrew Demshuk.
So thank you so much for the invitation to speak here today. I must say that after such fantastic talks, it is a hard act to follow. So today, because I am a European historian and someone who looks especially at the Cold War, I'll be looking at a somewhat different context than what we've been looking at. And so I'd like to start with the provocative question, I suppose, of what exactly does Karl Marx have to do with Charlottesville? And I would say at an historic moment when debates rage about the fate of monuments across so much of the United States, it is instructive to explore how the politics of memory have evolved for contentious monuments on another continent and in a very different context. In communist East Germany, oxidized brass and copper semblances of long-deceased personages were also elevated and then, after 1989, eliminated due to connotations that were rooted in public traumas that transcended the man, or very occasionally the woman, represented and honored. And perhaps one of the most controversial instances of this politics of dead men's bodies, dead men's monuments, took place in the city of Leipzig, which was the second largest city in East Germany and home to the oldest university in East Germany, the second oldest university in Germany today. And it took place on a square that, right after World War II, was renamed Karl Marx Square. And it was here on Karl Marx Square that in 1974, this 33-ton bronze relief was erected over the main portal of the university. The short version of the name of this monument was Aufbruch, which means breaking out, but the longer version was, quote, Karl Marx and the revolutionary, world-shattering essence of his teachings. Now, this was officially put up here on the main university facade to celebrate the anniversary of the founding of the state of East Germany, 25th anniversary. However, as I will discuss with you today, there was a much darker reason, a very political reason, that this monument was erected in 1974 on this site. And for reasons that I will discuss, it was especially contentious what to do with this gigantic monument after the end of communism in 1989. There were discussions of smashing it to bits and displaying fragments of it in the city. There was talk of melting it down and building another monument out of it. There was talk of burying it. No one really wanted to leave it where it was. Ultimately, the decision that was reached was to exile this monument to a remote piece of the sport campus of the University of Leipzig and put in front of it this very large explanatory text that you see this group of children being instructed in. And this text offers a sense of how the meaning of this monument has changed over time. And as you said, I'm going to be talking today a bit about how spaces are layered And I'd like to introduce an analogy today that is used in memory studies sometimes that could be useful when we think about monuments and when we think about space. And this is the idea of the palimpsest. I don't know if anyone in here has ever heard of a palimpsest. Anybody ever heard of a palimpsest? Got a couple people who've heard of a palimpsest. Well, the idea of a palimpsest is this. In ancient times, there was a shortage on parchment, right? There wasn't so very much parchment. And so parchment with certain meanings that were written on them would be cleared, it would be erased, and new meanings would be written on those parchments. And so one of the ways in which we gain incredible insights into the ancient world is sometimes to use imaging technology and such to read what was written underneath the medieval layer to see the ancient layer on these levels of parchment. And so when we use the word palimpsest to discuss space, to discuss monuments, we're talking about trying to read space or read monuments as a layered entity, as a palimpsest. And so when I talk about this Karl Marx monument, we're going to talk about this space on Karl Marx Square as a layered space, as a palimpsest space with different meanings that have been inscribed upon it. And these meanings that carry such political connotations so often can take something that is just, in essence, an object made of oxidized metal and give it so much salience, put so much at stake that you will have individuals who speak about smashing it, melting it down, burying it, eliminating it in some way. In the same way that other monuments can take on such salience and become holy relics or icons, right? Okay, so let me tell you now why it is that Karl Marx Square was such a political space. This is what Karl Marx Square looked like in the 1950s. And just to orient you, if you were curious, this, I don't know if there's a laser on here, is there? Okay, well, I'm going to step out here and point. This is where Karl Marx is going to be in 1974, right? Yeah. Excellent. You don't need laser pointers. That is where Karl Marx is going to be in 1974. You'll note that there is a church standing there in the 1950s. That is what was called the Church of St. Paul, or the University Church. When the faculty of the University of Leipzig fled from we could say the Hussite revolutionaries in Prague in the 15th century, they founded their university in what was a Dominican monastery. And that church was the center of the university. And this university church survived World War II as a rare example of a late medieval Gothic hall church, as they call it. You can see next to it the facade of the main university building. The front of it was burned out. The back of it was actually still in use with beautiful historicist eclecticist statues and stuff inside. Older people in Leipzig still remember this university building. The story goes that when the Americans were bombing the city in the war, the bombs bounced off the roof of the church and took out the building right next to it, which was a cafe, and hit the main university building. And you also had dedicated university curators and such who climbed on the roof and patched it before any damage. In other words, a rare, intact Gothic church. However, 1960, the state, the communist state under Walter Ulbricht, sort of the dictator of East Germany, decided that they didn't want this church on the square anymore. And there were many reasons for this. Part of the scandal was that it was such a broad thing coming out of the administration. The communists don't like having churches on squares, right? Your modern architect said, let's create a modern square for the future, and the university administration, including the president, who was a medieval historian, if you can believe that, wanted to tear this church down so they could get modern facilities. And so you have this broad-based idea, and then the propaganda begins, right? This church, in official parlance, is not a work of art. It is ultimately considered, in official parlance, a ruin. And the state developed this myopic view that everyone thinks like us. Everyone come work with us to build the better communist future. We know that there's just a few rabble-rousers who don't think like us. In fact, this was, I argue in my book, this was the largest instance of public protest in East German history between the 1953 uprising and the 1989 revolution. And the stakes were high, because the same local officials who were in power in 1968, when this thing was demolished, were the ones who ordered the police to shoot at unarmed protesters, killing a number of them in 1953 during the uprising. That's right, before we had 1956 in Hungary and 1968 in Czechoslovakia, we had the 1953 uprising in East Germany. So East Germany was not a quiet place in 1968, and on this square you had police fences, you had police dogs attacking protesters, you had police with infrared watching who was on the square, people get locked up, people throwing roses over the fence, all of this sort of thing, right before the Prague Spring crackdown. And another way in which individuals protested this demolition was to take secret pictures. These are pictures of the demolition of this church in 1968 using a telephoto lens from a private apartment room. And this fellow thought until after the end of communism he was the only one who had a row of these pictures. Actually, a number of people did, and this very act could have gotten them in big trouble. So let me show you what Fritz Tacke got for us out the window of his apartment. And I would also like to point out for you the structure in the background. You see there's another church. That is the Church of St. Nicholas, where in 1989, the peaceful revolution against communist rule is going to crystallize and spread across the entire republic. And so let us not forget as well, the memory of this demolition remained alive for the people of the city and the people of the East German Republic, so-called Democratic Republic. And it was from this church to the neighboring Karl Marx Square, then, that the revolution will break out. So we could say private resentment certainly was very strong after the demolition of the university church. And then in the face of this widespread resentment, the decision was reached by the authorities to erect a monument to Karl Marx. This monument is the defining symbol for the square and the city. And I'll say there was earlier discussion, just a couple months before the demolition of this church, about how to honor this space and Karl Marx. There had been a long history, actually, because they did erect a monument to Stalin on the square. Didn't last very long because of de-Stalinization in 1956. And there was a plan also to build a monument to Walter Ulbricht, who I mentioned was the dictator of East Germany. It was supposed to be a charming statue of him instructing the children in the way of communism. But that didn't come together because he retired. But Karl Marx you can always use. And so on the 150th anniversary of the philosopher's birthday in May 1968, right before the demolition of this church, the atmosphere was so hostile that students boycotted most of the events for Karl Marx's anniversary, and the university had to cancel many of them. In fact, there was only one event that I found in the archives for this anniversary of Karl Marx right before this demolition that the students went to in droves. And that was, let me see if I can get the title of it right, Against the Tyrannous Militarist Western Fascist Attack on Vietnam. That one was full. But aside from that one lecture, the students boycotted the Karl Marx events. And so, again, though, nonetheless, the state moves forward to put up this Karl Marx monument, and as the university president said, putting up this monument will finally make the Karl Marx University on Karl Marx Square worthy of the name of Karl Marx. I don't know if I mentioned it was the KMU, Karl Marx University, during the communist period. So this is what the square looked like right before the end of communism. This was the final version of the new university. You can see where the university church had once stood was completely wiped out by the Karl Marx monument, which is that black blotch on front of that rather unremarkable piece of modern architecture. And this was to signify by the university authorities and the state authorities that Karl Marx was to be the defining ideological symbol for this square to the end of time. But of course, the verdict of history shifted radically when the people of Leipzig marched on the square, triggered the fall of communist power, and in 1993, as the university got rid of the name of Karl Marx University, so no more KMU, a damning inscription was literally inscribed. So we're back to our palimpsest metaphor, but literally inscribed on the cornerstone of the university. And the inscription went something like this, that this demolition of the university church was an arbitrary act that the university itself had failed to withstand. This church had withstood the ages, but could not withstand the tyranny of an authoritarian system. And the idea of this demolition as an act of cultural barbarism, that those very words, in German they call it Kulturbarbarei, this idea of cultural barbarism could now be spoken aloud in 1989. And it's interesting then to say, well, what happens to this space then afterwards? One of the more intriguing ideas was what was called the installation. 1998, local artists created a skeleton that was meant to symbolize the vanished university church, to, in other words, superimpose two different layers of history on top of each other, to disempower the Karl Marx emblem by reminding the entire city and the world of what had been there before. You can also see, of course, there's another reason why the university is less interested in this new iconography, and that is that this building was very horribly built. You can see just after a few years it's in pretty bad shape. So in 2007, the university actually also then condoned the demolition of this campus in the hopes of getting, yet again, new facilities. It's interesting that this new facility is a postmodern Gothic structure. And, you know, it's interesting because so much postmodern architecture has a bad name these days, right? I mean, postmodernism can be so boring. I mean, I think this facility is an example of a smart postmodern building that can carry so many layers and symbols, and this building as well. The structure, which was designed by a Dutch architect, is meant to capture the moment of the demolition of the church, almost like in a crystalline ether. The pillars inside, the Gothic pillars, are actually suspended and illuminated, never touching the floor, as though when you're inside under this white vaulting, you're caught in this moment, almost of apotheosis at the same time that it is destruction. I might also mention that the preceding church was a place of music and culture. Johann Sebastian Bach, who was in Leipzig for much of his career, had tempered the organ, which was, of course, demolished with the church itself. And so now, yet again, this is a space of music, a space of reflection. But not always an easy decision was this on what to build on this site. There was actually also a campaign to rebuild a replica of the church as it had looked before. And so this discussion, what do we build on these traumatic sites? How do we commemorate them? These battles over memory and space are not unique to our own circumstance, and it may be interesting to see what happened in other places. And a good example of this is a bronze model that was placed right in front of that postmodern structure by the faction in the city that wanted to build a replica to the church. And so it's an intriguing, I could say, juxtaposition that there, right in front of the postmodern structure, you have a bronze model, and I don't know if those of you who are aware, but these bronze models are all over the place in Europe for the blind, right? And so if you're blind and you visit Leipzig and you want to feel what the structure is on this historic square, you will feel the university church as it had existed before 1968, not the postmodern structure that is there now. So it's an interesting juxtaposition that again speaks to different, we could say, battles, contestations, and solutions for how to talk about this memory. You'll also note the inscription, University Church of St. Paul, consecrated 1240, demolished 1968. So again, remembering this demolition. Now, as I said at the beginning, this commemorative victory for the university church did not, however, mean destruction for Karl Marx. It was in 2008 that his likeness was safely banished to this remote courtyard, and in contrast to fears that Karl Marx might become a target for vandalism or for communist nostalgia, this 1974 monument has enjoyed peaceful obscurity and an active place in educational programs for the city of Leipzig. Those who do find it benefit from the commemorative plaque, stories that explain the past and discuss in detail why this monument to one of the great German philosophers who was driven from this square has so very little to do with the figure for whom that monument had been built. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If our panelists